Hello everyone, welcome to my channel SW Metro official channel. Exposed in court, Kody's sons destroy him with shocking testimony. Kody Brown found himself stripped of his bravado, his voice trembling as his sons, men he had once carried on his shoulders, taught to hunt, laughed with at family cookouts, and disciplined with a stern hand when necessary, took the witness stand and, one by one, tore through the carefully constructed image he had spent decades building on reality television and in the court of public opinion, reducing him from the loud, commanding head of a sprawling plural family to a cornered man, desperate to defend himself against the people who knew him best, who had lived under his roof and absorbed both the best and the worst of him, and who now had the power, with their words, to crush him completely. The courtroom was packed, reporters scribbling furiously, fans of the show clutching their phones to live-tweet every revelation, while Kody sat red-faced beside his lawyers, casting furtive glances at Robin, who sat a few rows behind, her eyes wide, lips pressed tightly together as though she knew this day had been coming all along, but could not stop it. The first blow came from Garrison, whose tragic death had already cast a shadow over the family, but here his preserved testimony in earlier depositions and digital evidence was presented, showing in painstaking detail his claims of neglect, anger, and favoritism that cut like a knife through Kody's defenses. He described a father who had become increasingly absent, consumed by his devotion to one wife at the expense of his relationships with his children, a man who enforced strict loyalty tests that drove wedges between siblings and made holidays and birthdays battlegrounds instead of celebrations. As the attorneys read aloud Garrison's words, the gallery fell silent, each syllable echoing like a hammer against the fragile shell of Kody's pride, and when they played videos showing private conversations recorded in moments of raw honesty, where sons vented about their father's hypocrisy, lecturing about family unity while privately refusing to call or visit unless conditions were met, the jury members shifted uncomfortably, aware that they were not merely arbitrating a family squabble but standing in judgment of a man who had used his wives and children as props in a reality show empire. Then came Gabriel, once soft-spoken, now with a steely determination in his eyes, stepping into the witness box with a mix of sadness and resolve, recounting the infamous night when he tried to call his father on his birthday only to be brushed aside in favor of COVID rules and Robin's household, a wound that never healed and instead festered into a painful memory of rejection so deep it turned love into bitterness. He spoke slowly, clearly, as though determined not to let his emotions cloud the truth, explaining how Kody's refusal to prioritize his children left scars that couldn't be erased by belated apologies or public relations spin. Gabriel's testimony cracked something in Kody, his face contorted as he shook his head violently, mouthing denials, but the jurors only saw a man unraveling under the weight of his children's truth. And when Gabriel described how he had felt forced to compete for his father's attention with a woman who was not even his biological mother, a ripple of gasps swept through the courtroom. Hunter followed, a son who had once been proud of his father, who had defended him against critics, who had believed in the dream of one big united family, but who now confessed with palpable regret that the man he once looked up to had abandoned that dream the moment it no longer served him, turning what had once been a symbol of resilience into a hollow shell of favoritism, broken promises, and financial manipulation. He detailed conversations where Kody pressured him to side against his siblings, where loyalty to the patriarch was demanded above loyalty to truth, and where dissent was punished not with fists but with silence, exclusion, and emotional exile. Each word Hunter spoke was like a dagger thrust into the narrative Kody had spun for years on television, the narrative of a misunderstood leader who had been unfairly maligned by bitter ex-wives and rebellious kids. Now, under oath, that narrative was unraveling, piece by piece, as his sons collectively painted a picture of a man consumed not by love for his family but by an insatiable need for control and validation. The courtroom drama intensified when Logan, the eldest, the one who had carried so much responsibility as a pseudo-parent, reluctantly but firmly confirmed the stories of manipulation and favoritism, recalling nights when his younger brothers would cry because their father had broken yet another promise, recalling tense dinners where Kody would storm off rather than admit fault, recalling moments where he himself had been forced to choose between protecting his siblings and appeasing his father. His testimony was especially damning because it came not with anger but with sorrow, the sorrow of a man who had tried for years to bridge the gap, to give his father the benefit of the doubt, but who could no longer pretend the damage wasn't real. By the time Pay Dawn, Christine's only son, strode to the stand, there was a palpable sense that the tide had turned irreversibly, that Kody was drowning in a sea of his children's truths, and Pay Dawn, never one to mince words, delivered the harshest blows yet, mocking his father's obsession with appearances, his constant refrain that the wives left me when, in fact, it was the children who had first felt abandoned, insisting that a man who cannot maintain relationships with the very people he created has no right to claim the title of father in any meaningful sense. Pay Dawn leaned forward, staring directly at Kody as he said it, and the room seemed to freeze, the silence so sharp it was almost deafening, while Kody shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face twisted with anger and humiliation. The attorneys pressed on, presenting financial records that showed discrepancies in how funds were distributed among the households, with Robin's children receiving advantages not given to the others, bolstering the son's claims that favoritism wasn't just emotional but material, tangible, and measurable in dollars and opportunities. Every revelation piled higher and higher until Kody's defense team appeared overwhelmed, their objections increasingly desperate, their attempts to discredit the sons faltering against the sheer consistency and passion of their testimonies. Outside the courthouse, fans who had once argued endlessly online about who was to blame in the Brown family saga now seemed united in their shock, their disbelief giving way to a grim acknowledgement that the sons had finally confirmed what had long been suspected, that the fractures in the Brown family weren't the fault of rebellious kids or bitter ex-wives, but of a man whose insecurities and need for control corroded the very relationships he claimed to treasure. Inside, as the day drew to a close, Kody sat slumped, his once booming voice reduced to whispers, his son's words echoing in the air like a verdict before the verdict, a testament to the power of truth spoken by those who had suffered longest and hardest under the weight of a father who demanded loyalty but forgot love, who sought obedience but failed at compassion, and who now faced the crushing reality that no amount of bluster, no amount of television spin, could shield him from the undeniable force of his sons united against him, their shocking testimony forever rewriting the legacy of Kody Brown. Kody Brown, the patriarch of the sprawling polygamous family from TLC's sister wives, had long been cracking under the weight of his own ego, favoritism, and failed leadership. But in a stark, fluorescent-lit courtroom, far from the curated drama of reality television, that facade didn't just crack, it was systematically, ruthlessly, and irrevocably demolished. The instruments of its destruction were not his estranged wives, whose grievances could be dismissed as feminine emotion, but his own sons, the very heirs to his legacy. The testimony of Garrison and Gabe Brown was not merely shocking, it was a devastating act of patriarchal collapse, a moment where the sons laid bare the profound emotional bankruptcy of their father with a clarity and courage that left him exposed and utterly alone at the defense table. For years, the audience watched Kody operate within a self-made mythology of a benevolent king, a lion protecting his pride. He spoke in grandiose terms about loyalty, respect, and family unity, all while visibly orchestrating its fragmentation through his blatant favoritism for Robin and her children. His authority, however, was never truly challenged on its own terms until his sons, raised on his rhetoric, used his own language to hold him accountable. Their testimony cut so deep precisely because it came from a place of intimate knowledge. They weren't outsiders critiquing his lifestyle, they were insiders who had lived by his rules, fought for his approval, and ultimately witnessed the hypocrisy festering at the core of his leadership. They dismantled him not with anger, though it was certainly present, but with a heartbreaking narrative of specific, personal betrayals that painted a picture of a man who had abandoned his most fundamental duties as a father. The most damning element of their testimony was its focus on the unforgivable sin of omission during a period of profound crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. Kody had used the pandemic as the ultimate litmus test for loyalty, creating a draconian set of rules that were less about science and more about control, isolating himself primarily with Robin's family while treating his other wives and children as biohazards. Gabe and Garrison detailed the soul-crushing experience of being treated as contagious threats by their own father. They spoke of birthdays forgotten, of texts and calls ignored, of the agonizing loneliness of being deliberately excluded from the family circle. Gabe, his voice thick with an emotion that transcended television drama, recounted the specific, searing pain of his father forgetting his birthday entirely. This was not a simple mistake, it was a symbolic annihilation. In that forgotten date, the sons saw the truth, they had been erased from their father's heart and mind, their existence contingent upon their blind obedience, not their inherent worth as his children. Kody's defense, both in the court and in the count of public opinion, had always been his self-proclaimed role as the family's leader, demanding respect as his divine right. His sons masterfully turned this argument against him. They testified to a man who demanded respect but offered none in return, a leader who sought unwavering loyalty but provided no protection or sustenance to his followers. They described his rules as arbitrary and shifting, designed not for safety but for compliance, and his enforcement as cruel and capricious. The image they conjured was not of a strong patriarch but of a petty tyrant, ruling over a dwindling kingdom of one wife and her children, while the rest of his empire seceded in quiet despair. They exposed the fundamental flaw in Kody's philosophy: leadership is not a title one claims, it is a responsibility one earns through sacrifice, consistency, and love. By detailing his absence, his neglect, and his emotional abandonment, they proved he had failed every metric of leadership he himself had established. Furthermore, the testimony shattered the last vestiges of Kody's narrative that the family's fracture was the fault of his wives, particularly Christine, for poisoning the children against him. Garrison and Gabe made it unequivocally clear that their disillusion